Okay, good morning, everybody. We'll get started as people trickle in here. Thanks for joining the October Northern Forest Bird Network webinar series. I am so excited today because we have one of our partners joining from UW Stevens Point, Mike Demchik and Emilia Skogen. They're going to be presenting today on irregular shelterwood, prescribed fire, and neotropical migratory songbirds. So I'll just give a little intro for Mike and Amelia, and then I'll let them take it away. So Mike Demchek is a professor of silviculture with the College of Natural Resources at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. His research area is in managing woodlands with a habitat focus, savanna and barrens restoration, density control for better stem quality in trees, methodologies to train foresters to mark timber faster, better, and with more confidence, and developing the American hazelnut into a commercial oilseed and confectionery and nut crop. Demchek has successfully initiated or installed over 1,000 acres of wildlife habitat and ecosystem restoration on public land demonstration units across northern and central Wisconsin. We are also here with his grad student, Emilia Skogen. She's a grad student of UW Stevens Point and a teaching assistant, and she's researching the impacts of irregular shelterwood and prescribed fire on habitat that's used by Neotropical Migratory, which we're featuring migratory birds that we're featuring today. She is also creating a tool that land managers can use to assess habitat management success via the bird surveys. And she has worked across the U.S., gaining fieldwork experience in veg surveys, bird surveying, netting, banding, territory mapping, nest searching, and radio telemetry tracking. Amelia has banded 836 plus birds, which I'm sure is more now since the bio was written, and over 50 species ranging from ruby-throated hummingbird to greater sage grouse. So thank you so much for being here, and we're really excited to hear about your project.
Okay, so I'm going to get right into this. So I'm going to start this out just with some general ideas on targets. And I want kind of looking at this as like a recipe. And when we're doing work that's targeting basically bird habitat with forest management, there are a few particular structural characteristics we're looking at. One is young forest, usually looking at between 5 to 20% of the property in young forest. And it kind of depends on the species you're targeting. Species that are more young forest dependent, like golden wing warbler is an example, your percentage is going to be higher, but with some other species, 5% might be adequate. It's going to depend really on what you're targeting. For older forest, many of the species we deal with do a portion of the lifespan, life cycle in the lake states and young forest, but another portion of it in older forest. So we're looking for at least 20% in old forest. The importance of oak is pretty high on these. With oak forest, you're looking at a genus which feeds an awful lot of insects, some of the highest diversity of insects that you have within the lake states feed on oak trees. And so that provides foods for these birds. And also variation in overstored density because different conditions feed different life cycles for animals. Bark foraging. We have a lot of our organisms that are bark foragers, and the characteristic of bark that actually makes it good for these organisms is a lot of fissures and cracks and locations for insects to hide. And so bark that has a higher propensity to have that tends to be better for these species. Gaps of varying sizes, so anywhere from 5 to 20% of the forest. When we look at gaps, some of the elements of these gaps that are important are, first of all, the young forest that grows in them. So you end up with either shrub cover or young tree cover, which many of our species use for nesting. But then you also have this mid-canopy foraging by a wide range of species, which gives that opportunity. And finally, you also have many species that act as organisms that hawk. So they'll sit on either branches or leaves and will hawk out into these openings to actually grab insects. So having those gaps basically favors those organisms. Conifer inclusions is another one. There's a tendency with northern hardwood stands to actually remove conifers from them. And so the prescriptions written for them will literally say, cut all balsam as an example. And in some stand conditions, cutting all the balsam is a good idea, where you essentially have nothing but a sea of balsam in the understory. It actually is a problem for regeneration. but where it's a percentage of the stand, cutting those out actually limits a lot of the habitat. We have some species that are pretty dependent on those. Things like, as an example, black-throated green warblers have really strong need for those. Blackburnian are a species they're going to prefer hemlock, but they're going to use balsam and fir. And then if we look at within the lake states, spruce budworm, um, while they call it spruce budworm, it actually prefers feeding on balsam. And those end up providing a significant percentage of the food for things like Cape May warblers, bay-breasted warblers, Blackburnian warblers, chestnut-sided warblers. So conifer inclusions are pretty important. Cavity trees, snags, and then I have ICOs, which is individuals, clusters, and openings. Percentage of our species are cavity nesting birds. Those trees that actually produce cavities or the snags. We're in the lake states. It's pretty humid here. Our snags don't last very long. And so that creates a challenge. Our cavity trees, by comparison, have a much longer longevity on the sites. And so maintenance of both of those ends up favoring these cavity nesting organisms and have individuals, clusters, and openings. You'll have species that prefer using individual trees for singing perches or for nesting, ones that actually do better with clusters. And then openings, there are some organisms that are dependent on having trees available but open areas adjacent to it. So focus on doing your management where you have those. Ecological reserves, another component. We have some organisms that are fairly disturbance sensitive. They actually require management, but for the first few years after management, they're fairly disturbance sensitive. And so an example of that might be scarlet tanager as an example. So maintaining some areas that are unharvested in an otherwise network of heavily managed land will work. And finally, grassy openings. Grassy openings are a funny one because what you end up with is foresters see an open area, they see it as a regeneration failure. And what they end up wanting to do is plant it to trees. And that sounds good, but the tendency from that point on is then to actually take the species which are dependent on those grassy openings and actually basically eliminate them from the sites. So maintaining some areas at least temporarily as grassy openings actually facilitates habitat for a lot of these. And when you roll that together as a big package, what you end up is a pretty broad range of organisms that can utilize the sites. So broke this into two projects. The project number one is oak and prescribed fire. And project number two is the demonstration areas with the associated bird use. A lot of central Wisconsin has oak like this. It's not super high quality. For the most part, it's going to be going out as wood for railroad ties, pallet wood, possibly flooring wood or pulp. It's a relatively low value timber product. However, it has one significant advantage. It's got a lot of silvicultural flexibility because they do tend to have a competitive advantage for oak on the sites. The lower quality soils generally generate lower quality timber product, but they actually are easier to get to turn back to oak. By comparison, the sites that generate the higher quality timber tend to be more difficult to get to turn back to oak. And within those settings, one thing that's pretty important is the use of prescribed fire. So, problem you'll run into is that many of these sites had a history of fire if you go back 100 years, but fire's been removed from the system due to policies of fire suppression. And what you've ended up with is a pretty significant loss of a really important process for a range of our species. And so we set up a project where we're essentially looking at the impact of prescribed fire in irregular shelterwoods. And Emilia will be talking a little bit later about the bird use impact of it. And there was some significant bird use impact, as you would expect. So that leads us to two chapters for Emilia's thesis. The first one is use neotropical migratory bird, or using neotropical migratory bird use to model success of habitat-focused forest management in central and northern Wisconsin. And the other one is characterizing neotropical migratory bird use and prescribed burn forest management units in central Wisconsin. And so two distinct projects, but they do interact with each other. We have two main objectives of this: to use pre and post burn bird survey data to assess impacts of prescribed burn, canopy cover retention, and then habitat measures on neotropical migratory bird use. And then the other one is develop a tool for land managers that will allow them to assess habitat management needs based on neotropical migratory bird presence or desired presence. And we're going to detail both of those. So our study sites in Wisconsin, they're focused more heavily in central Wisconsin. We have one northeastern site over on Chambers Island. And essentially this is the spread of those sites across the state. The demonstration units part of the project, we already have quite a bit online about this. And so if you were to go to the Wisconsin Forestry Center website, look up forest management for wildlife habitat demonstration sites, this is what you'll find. It's basically a website that details each of the sites we have. And then you can go into the demonstration units and find out specifically what's happening on each site. Now, I will comment. Do you see how several of these have the word coming soon listed on it? So our person that was originally setting up the website on this changed jobs. And then our forestry center director retired. And then the person that was doing the websites filled that role until she actually left for another job. Meaning we're in a bit of flux right now with the people that are actually doing the graphic design on it. These will be filled in the future, but there's a collection of those 5 sites there that we have quite a bit of information available. And these are all open for public access, so people can go to these sites, park there, and there are maps on the sites to detail what's going on. So general background for our oak. For the oak irregular shelterwood and fire project, the work was done on dry nutrient poor sites. The oak in the sites is predominantly northern pin oak and black oak. And then there's associated species on these sites. There are aspen, red maple, white and red pine, and then bur and white oak. So the original objective of the project is to look at the impact of overstory retention on the density of regeneration, the aggregate height of regeneration, and then how much of it stocks as oak. To give you an idea of what this looks like, and for those of you that like golden wing warblers, what you're essentially seeing is absolutely beautiful preparation for golden wing warbler habitat right here. Essentially, you're looking at a site where parts of it are completely open. Those are research units looking at low crown cover percent. Part of it is at 15%, parts at 30%, and parts at 45% crown closure. And so those are spread across the unit. There are 5 of these sites, 1 in Adams County, 3 in Waushara County, and 1 in Portage County. 4 of them were harvested during the winter of 2007 to 2008. 1 of them was harvested in the winter of 2008 to 2009 because these were on 2-year contracts and it was just difficult to get them all done in a single year. And they vary in site index and they vary in age. So the youngest one was 56 years old. The oldest one was 89. And they vary. They're around the lower or mid-range site indexes for this area. And for basal area, they were functionally fully stocked sites. These were on fairly sandy soils. One of the sites is an outwash sandplain soil. 3 of them are in morainal sand deposits, and then 1 of them is in a morainal sand deposit that was resculpted by meltwater and postglacial erosion. And for the soil side of this, for those that know this, taxonomy, Udi saments is basically sandy sand that is sand, whereas Arenae Capilodolphs mean sandy soil with a little bit of clay accumulation. But the defining term behind this is sand. They are droughty soils with low nutrient by nature. On each one of the sites, we set up 12 plots. And within those plots, we distributed 4 treatments: 0% crown closure, 15, 30, and 45% crown closure. And we did 3 replicates each on each site. And then we have 5 harvest units in 3 counties. So what these look like a couple of years after harvest, essentially you end up with dispersed reserve trees. Where possible, the reserve trees were within the white oak group, the bur oak group, and white pine. And then from those trees down, we saved basically black and northern pin oak to get to our crown cover goals. But we had a preference for maintaining long-lived overstory species. And some of the areas look like the previous, some of them look like this. This is one of the treatment areas, which is essentially completely open with no reserve trees.
All right. So for the 2024 summer field season, we had 20 total sites. For each of these sites, we did 2 bird survey visits each. There were 257 points total and well over 20,000 individual bird observations on these sites.
That sounds like a lot, Amelia.
Yeah, there were a lot of birds. And then at each of these sites, we did 1 vegetation survey, and that was over the course of 1 to 2 visits, dependent on schedule. For the bird surveys, we followed National Ecological Observatory Network protocol for data standardization. Surveys were done during hours of peak bird activity, which is 30 minutes before sunrise all the way till 5 hours after sunrise. Surveys were 6 minutes long. Birds were noted by minute observed. So if you had already observed a bird minute 1, you would not count that bird minute 2 because it had already been noted for that survey. We also collected information on species, distance from observer to bird, how the bird was identified, so by sight, visual, etc. Sex of bird. For most of these, it was going to be unknown because you can't confidently sex a bird just by whether or not it's singing. And then whether or not the birds were juveniles, because juveniles are removed from analysis, and then if the birds were in a group. For navigation, we used the Avenza phone app and PDF maps. We collected distance using laser rangefinders. We collected temperature, wind, and relative humidity information with Kestrel units. We collected cloud cover using a visual estimate, and then the Merlin app was used for ID confirmation of birds. And then surveys were done in groups of 1 to 2 people, and if there were 2, then 1 person was the observer and 1 person was the recorder. For vegetation surveys done at each bird point, we collected BA, basal area, for live trees and snags, which are standing dead, and we collected that using an angle gauge. We also collected canopy percent covered visual estimates. So for that, mid and understory were lumped together, and then overstory was a separate assessment. And those were independent observations that were then averaged. We also collected canopy cover using a spherical densiometer. We also collected invasive percent cover visual estimate. So that was done in a 5 by 5 meter square that we paced out and then put into a percentage category. And then lastly, we used a modified robopole method. So we noted if it was woody or herbaceous vegetation or downed material, and then the height category that the material was in and the percentage of the pole that was covered. So with this, we combined visual obstruction and height into 1 measurement for efficiency in the field. So this is a picture of what the robopole that I made looked like. We collected data in 4 cardinal directions. We paced out 5 meters from the bird point center. The pole in total is 7 feet tall because a lot of birds use that height group of vegetation. And then it's made out of 1 foot sections. And then each of these colorful increments are 3 inches. So the white is the bottom of the foot section and the blue is the top of it. And the number for the foot was noted in the blue section. And then for obstruction, if at least 50% of a section was covered, it was marked as obscured. So these are 2 examples of that for the 2 foot height class in these images. On the left, pretending that light green is herbaceous and dark green is woody vegetation. On the left, because one of those sections is obscured, you would mark the 2 foot section as 25% obscured by herbaceous vegetation. And then on the right, you would say 2 foot, 75% obscured because 3 of those sections are covered. And in this case, herbaceous and woody vegetation. So for prescribed burn unit bird use, the burned site was called Greenwood West, and the unburned site was called Greenwood East. These sites were in a similar area. We collected the same bird and habitat data on these sites, and data analysis is still in process for this, so these are just preliminary data at this point. So on the map from before, this is where these sites are in central Wisconsin. And this is a top-down view of the sites. So Greenwood West is the one up top with the red marker, and Greenwood East is the unburned site with the green marker on this map. The Greenwood West prescribed fire was done on May 6th, which was 25 days before I went in and did the first bird survey on the site. There was variable fire intensity across the unit. And this is a bubble map of the birds seen in 2024 on Greenwood East, so the unburned site. So there were 34 species total, and the larger circles on here correspond to more bird observations. So this is for rose-breasted grosbeak. There were 25 to 30 observations for the ones with the large circles, and the ones with the really small circles, like white-throated sparrows, had like 1 to 2 observations. So the bigger the circle, the more of the bird was observed on that site. Species with the most observations were rose-breasted grosbeak, American redstart, robin, chestnut-sided warbler, blue jay, ovenbird, American crow, and eastern towhee. Some of those species, so robins, blue jays, and crows, don't necessarily tell you a whole lot about the site because they're found everywhere, but some of those can kind of give some indicators about the habitat. And on Greenwood East, there were 34 species total observed, and I excluded Canada geese from that because those are flyovers. This is for Greenwood West, the burned site. So there were 46 species observed. And you can also see that apart from some of those more everywhere bird species like blue jays, there were some different species observed. So on Greenwood West, for example, there were a lot more gray catbirds observed than on Greenwood East. So this is another way to visualize that data. So this is species that were shared across sites, so they were observed on both sites, sorted by most difference in observations to least difference in observations. So on this end of it, the red columns are the burned site, Greenwood West, and the blue columns are the unburned site, Greenwood East. So for gray catbirds, for example, there were a lot more of them observed on Greenwood West than on Greenwood East. And then as you go this way on the graph, these are species that there were the exact same number of observations on each site. So great crested flycatchers and orchard orioles, there was no difference in number of observations. This is just pulling out a couple of those species. So you can see that there were a lot more gray catbirds and eastern wood pewees observed on the burned site. And there were a lot more chestnut-sided warblers and American redstarts seen on the unburned site. This is that in table format. So on this side, these are species that there were more observations in the unburned site. The first listed one is the greatest difference. So there were a lot more chestnut-sided warblers. And when you get down to yellow rump warblers and scarlet tanagers, there was not that much difference. This is that same information for the burned site. Down here are species that were unique, so they were only observed in the unburned site. And over here are species that were only observed in the burned site. From that list, I highlighted here some potentially representative species of the habitats in these areas. So for the unburned site, Greenwood East, potential representative species are golden-winged warbler, warning warbler, chestnut-sided warbler, American redstart, common yellowthroat, and blue-winged warbler. So summarizing the habitat that these birds use, they use early successional with dense herbaceous and shrub. They use a lot of regeneration and edge or opening habitat. And then particular elements that they use are things like saplings, hazelnut, brambles, grass, and goldenrods. So if you had done a survey like this in Wisconsin, and you wanted more specifics on the kinds of habitat that these birds use, it'd be really nice if there was a tool for that. So that ties into the second part of the project. which is creating a tool for land managers to use to assess habitat management needs based on neotropical migratory songbird species that are present or desired. So the input in this tool is a list of bird species, and the output is a list of habitat requirements for those species. As much as possible, I put specific information for Wisconsin or Minnesota. The output includes information on habitat, nesting information, information on foraging behavior, and stratum. And stratum just means the vertical component of the forest that they're using, and then any particularly important habitat elements for these species. It also includes whether or not they have a state or federal status listed. And if they have a state status listed, then it includes the Wisconsin recommended avoidance period for this species. This tool is going to be accessible online for free. I'm making it using Excel, RStudio, and RShiny, and a bunch of different literature resources, including Cornell, Wisconsin DNR, Wisconsin Bird Conservation Initiative, and a bunch of different scientific papers. So this is a visual of what it looks like. So you can type in your bird species up top by common name, and then it has all of that output as a table. And it sorts it by nest site. So you can see the shrub nesters and the tree nesters are paired together in the output. So now I'm going to get into some of the outputs from that tool for those species that I mentioned earlier. So these are for the greenwood east, so the unburned site species. Golden-winged warblers are a species of concern and of special concern on both federal and state levels for Wisconsin. For Greenwood East, all of the potentially representative birds that I pulled out are foliage-gleaning insectivores. Golden-winged warblers nest on the ground in dense herbaceous cover and shrub patches, and they use a lot of forest field edge, opening edge, or trail edge habitat. Their nests are often on the ground at the base of grassy or leafy clusters, so for example in goldenrods. Special elements for them is that they're strongly associated with young forest and alder thicket. They're also associated with wet sites, and they eat a lot of leaf roller caterpillars. An important habitat for them is that they need a diverse habitat landscape because they nest in young forest and they forage in older forest. For mourning warblers, they nest on or near the ground in dense vegetation, often in clearings, bogs, or trails or logging roads. Special elements for them is that they use regenerating areas from things like logging and prescribed fire. An important habitat for them is that they use disturbed early successional forest areas and areas with dense shrub or sapling cover, but without much canopy. Chestnut-sided warblers nest in shrubs near the ground and shrubby understory. They have some species that they favor nesting in, like deciduous trees and shrubs, hazel, brambles, and meadowsweets. Special elements for them is that they also have species that they prefer to forage in, like bramble, shrubs, serviceberry, hardwoods, and aspen. So at the bottom there is a picture that Mike had of one foraging in a serviceberry. An important habitat elements for them is early successional habitat, scrubby second growth, and forest edges. American redstarts nest often in woody shrubs and small trees near water. Something specific about the sites that they prefer to nest in is that they avoid generally smooth-barked species because it makes it difficult for them to adhere their nest material to. So they may avoid species like aspens, some conifer, and striped maple. Special elements for them is that they favor deciduous components of stands, large forest blocks, and mosaics of several ages of forest. An important habitat for them is regeneration pockets, because post-fledging redstarts of all ages tend to move into early successional forest. And it's thought that the reason for that is that the dense vegetation offers more opportunity for food, but also because of the dense cover lowers predation risk. Common yellowthroats nest in shrubs on or near the ground, and sometimes in grasses and sedges. Special elements for them is that they have certain species that they prefer to use, like hazelnut, red osier dogwood, brambles, native honeysuckle, and gooseberry. An important habitat for them is that they favor dense, tangled vegetation and wet areas. Blue-winged warblers nest on or near the ground, often in goldenrod or brambles, sometimes in grasses and sedges, and they utilize forest field transition areas with large trees. Special elements for them are forest edges and clearings, shrub successional habitat, and places with saplings. And important habitat elements for them are early to mid-successional habitat and a mix of dense herbaceous cover, shrubs, and saplings or small trees. These are potentially representative birds for Greenwood West, the burned site. So those are red-headed woodpecker, brown thrasher, gray catbird, eastern woodpewey, Baltimore oriole, cedar waxwing, and eastern kingbird. So summarizing the kinds of habitat used by these species, it tends to be open areas with scattered or lone trees. They utilize gaps. They also use snags and dead limbs on live trees, and scrub, shrubby, and edge habitat. So red-headed woodpeckers are omnivores, and they're kind of unique among woodpeckers because they do fly catching, but they nest in cavities, oftentimes in large snags or in the dead limbs of live trees. They favor oaks, but they will use other species. And their nests are often located in open areas with minimal ground vegetation or without much overstory or understory. Special elements for them is that they favor clusters of snags or trees with dead limbs because they need several of them for roosting and foraging nearby each other. Important habitat for them is that they favor open upland sites with scattered trees, so things like oak and pine savannas or tree rows by farms, and to a lesser extent, they favor lowland forests. For red-headed woodpeckers with regards to prescribed fire may create more open conditions, which improves fly catching opportunities for this bird. Prescribed fire can also create snags and dead limbs for them to utilize for nesting cavities. But prescribed fire, depending on intensity, may also destroy previously used nest snags, which is important for this species because red-headed woodpeckers are also kind of unique among woodpeckers in that they will reuse nest cavities for several years. Brown thrashers are omnivore and ground foragers. As my friend calls them, they're like the raccoons of the sky. They'll eat pretty much anything. They nest in shrub, often low in dense cover or under downed cover. So the picture on the right there is a photo of a brown thrasher nest that Mike got under downed cover. They also favor oak grub and thorny plants for nesting sites. Special elements for them is that they forage in leaf litter for insects, seeds, and fallen fruit. An important habitat for them is brushy and grass areas, and they're most common in shrubby edge habitat and mid-successional forests. Gray catbirds eat insects and fruit. They're a ground forager. They nest in shrubs up to 2 meters from the ground, and they're often found in shrubs, saplings, and small trees, and sometimes with a vine component. Special elements for them is that they favor deciduous components of stands and areas with regeneration and edge habitat. Important habitat for them is dense shrubby, shrub sapling, forest edge or clearing habitat, riparian corridors, and shrub or scrub wetland. So they use a bunch of different areas, but gray catbirds utilize a lot of edge habitat. So they're a very common species in places like urban parks or in narrow riparian corridors because they're using the edge habitat available there. Eastern woodpeweys eat insects. They do that by fly catching. They nest in trees or saplings in a horizontal branch up to 22 meters above the ground. And they often use large oaks and maples, American basswood, and paper birch for nesting sites. Special elements for them are areas that are more open with low density canopy cover, and they sit most frequently on a mid-canopy dead branch to do their sallies out to catch insects. Important habitat for them is that they favor deciduous components of stands, and they use many different types of wooded habitat and of many different sizes, but they tend to be more abundant if the area is larger. With regards to prescribed fire for eastern wood pewees, their density may increase with increased fire frequency and recency, and density for the species may also increase shortly after partial harvesting of oak shelterwoods. Baltimore orioles eat insects and fruit. They're a foliage gleaner. They nest in trees. They make a hanging nest, often in an isolated tree by water or a woodland edge. Special elements for them is that they favor deciduous trees, woodland edges, areas near water, and places with scattered or lone trees. An important habitat for them is open woods and having some kind of deciduous component in those woods for them to use. Cedar waxwings eat fruit, and in the summer, they'll eat a lot of insects. They're a foliage gleaner, but in the summer, they'll also eat insects from plants and aerial insects because they'll fly out from high exposed perches near water to go catch insects in the air. They nest at tree branches or forks, often in the edge of a wooded area in an isolated tree or by old field shrub habitat. Special elements for them, in addition to having exposed perches for them to fly out and catch insects, is edge habitat promoting fruiting shrubs or trees. And important habitat elements for them are open woodland, can be a lot of different types, shrubs and small trees, and riparian areas. They will utilize eastern red cedar, serviceberry, strawberry, mulberry cherries, raspberries, and red osier dogwood, but they will avoid interior forest habitat. Eastern kingbirds eat insects by flycatching. In an open area, they'll usually nest in a tree, and they'll create their nest on an area near the canopy edge of that tree. And then if it's an area near water, they tend to utilize snags. Species that they'll use in particular are oak, jack pine, black ash, alder, willow, hawthorn, apple, maple, elm, mulberry, and hornbeam, white cedar, and American sycamore. So they use a lot of different tree species. Special elements for them is that they sit on a perch 1 to 4 meters above the ground to go fly out and catch insects, and that perch can be herbaceous, shrub, or a fence. So you'll see them a lot along rural roadways for that reason. Important habitat for them is open areas, fields with dispersed shrubs or trees, places like strips of trees by farms or fields, orchards, woodland edges, and areas by water. So eastern kingbirds are most often found in open areas that have scattered trees as a component. Next steps for the research, I'm going to be getting more into data analysis. So looking at total abundance, species richness, Shannon diversity index, functional richness, and then also comparing those bird measures to those habitat measures. Next steps for the tool creation, I'm going to continue adding more species to that and also add a citation section because I want the citations to look well put together and easy to access for people. So I'm still working on formatting for that. And then the last part is user testing and feedback. So if you would like to be able to test out the tool and provide feedback, that would be much appreciated. If you're interested in that, please email me and I will send it out to you come late winter or early spring when it should be ready for testing.
So it's interesting because the 3 people who are the audience here are actually all 3 people that have been involved in this project in the past. So this is a long-term project. So, I mean, I have like 17 years into doing elements of this. So, I mean, it took a long time to get all these sites in place. McIntyre Stennis Cooperative Research Grants provided funding for the irregular shelterwood project originally and the follow-up work on it. A USDA Forest Service Landscape Scale Restoration Program grant is funding the creation and development of the demonstration units. UWSP UPDC grant has funded two components of this. Door County Land Trust funded the management plan and bird survey on Chambers Island. The Healthy Grown Initiative is an initiative of the Wisconsin Potato and Vegetable Growers Association, and they have provided access to sites that we've been using for some of our grassland restoration work. Um, Rough Grouse Society and American Woodcock Society funded creation of two of these units. Pittman Robertson funded the work on the Village Plover Conservancy and the Little Plover Fisheries area. Wisconsin DNR provided site access and hosting sites for several of these projects. Some of them are located on University of Wisconsin Stevens Point owned property, so the Property Management Committee was involved. The Wisconsin Wetlands Association was a collaborator that helped with a lot of the field work on two of the sites. U.S. Fish and Wildlife partnered on our Barrens work that we were doing. UWSP Foundation hosted multiple of the sites. For a lot of the work carried out on the closer sites to Stevens Point, UWSP Society for Ecological Restoration and Fire Crew carried out a lot of the work. Anywhere from seeding, seed collection, tree planting, prescribed burning, you name it. Then a collection of field technicians worked on the bird survey side of this. And honestly, I could list another probably 40 students over the years that have worked on individual sites. And then Mike Tiller, Jason Riddle, and Jordan on the call here on the Zoom here are the people that are acting as the advisory committee for Emilia. So a pretty broad collection of involved parties.
This is just a citation slide for anyone interested. We're going to open it up for questions.
Great. That's exciting. I learned today that cedar waxwing like eastern red cedar, and that's probably why I have so many in my yard because I have a pretty eastern red cedar. That was news to me. We did have a question from Camp Ripley. They do a lot of management on the Camp Ripley. It's a Sentinel landscape. And they are wondering, Amelia, on the survey methods. I did share that you followed the neon, but if you have any other insights on how you did the bird surveying, Camp Ripley is interested in that.
Um, yeah. Are you wondering about, like, do you want me to send you the protocol copy, or are you asking about specifics on that?
Sure, you could send over the protocol and I'll share it with their team. They're mainly curious about the part about using 1 to 3 people for surveying. Like how did you do that?
Yes. So for the teams, when it was one person, it was always me. The reasoning for that is just because out of the crew, I had the most experience with bird surveys, so I felt the most confident in bird ID. For teams of two, the important thing with that is that just one person is the observer and the other person is the recorder.
Mhm.
So the observer is the only person identifying any species on that, and they are saying the birds that they have noticed and the distances to those birds. So the thing with the protocol is that like there's a lot happening at once because you might have like 50 different birds that you're trying to keep track of not only species but also how you identified them, like a bunch of other info, and then the distance from you to the bird, and you have to get that for each individual one.
Mhm.
So that's when having two people comes in handy because you can have one person who's collecting all of that info and then saying it out loud as the survey is going. And then the other person is not observing any birds, they're just recording what the observer is saying.
And I can say this from so we're following Neon protocols with this pretty much because Neon has a gigantic available comparable data set. And my concern that I always have is I want my data when I look at other people's data that we're apples to apples comparison. And as much as there's some nuance that I would probably do differently if I was building the protocol, I like the protocol, so I'm not saying it's bad, but there's just some nuance I would do a little different. I prefer just having the comparability to other data sets. And so, yeah, for me, that's why we stayed with that protocol. And as far as the pair of people, frequently this is done with individual people doing the work. But as far as keeping track of which birds have actually been seen and then just safety, there's a lot of moving parts. And to quote my wife on this, all the birds get seen in the first minute. That's not really true, but it's like there's a lot of birds in one.
Yeah, I think the most birds, I think I had one spot where there were like 30 birds that I heard in the first minute. So it's a lot of like furiously writing things down. So if you have another person that you can just say all of that stuff to, it makes it a little bit faster.
Mhm.
It becomes, at least for most of the ones of these I've done, when my wife has been the majority of the people doing the survey with me when it's me. And there is a furious collection of recording stuff followed by a much more leisurely, oh yeah, look over there. And that is the nature of it. So yeah, having two people facilitates making that happen. However, Amelia
But
writes really fast, so that works.
yeah, and I will also say that I had the most experience on our crew in terms of like doing point count surveys on my own, so I was comfortable with that. But if you do use two people, something that's super, super important to reiterate is that one person has to be the sole observer and one person is just recording. And
And
that's important because you need to be able to assess who the observer was and keep that consistent in terms of
Yeah,
like accounting for biases, because people might observe more of one species more frequently just because they know that bird better.
that's a good point. They say thank you for the clarification. We had a question from Michael Fitzgibbon. He's wondering what scale as an acreage maximizes benefits for desired species for the target forest types that were in the first slide.
so that is an adorable question, and I'm going to say why it is. So I had a graduate student, Dan Meyer, who did a Barrens restoration project. He's since graduated, and we're working on drafts of this to get it published. And what I can say is on that project, one of the biggest deliverables for the birds is the scale of it, is the impact. The bigger the scale of the restoration work done, the larger the diversity and richness of birds you get. And so scale plays a huge role. And I'm sure there is some upper limit to where you get asymptotic, where after it's big enough, it's big enough. But it's a loaded question because there's no fixed endpoint. As you start getting bigger on these restoration or these research units, the impact gets bigger.
Perfect.
So
That's
I
a
wish
great
I could
question.
give 32 acres as an answer, but that's not a what I'm saying. It's literally the scale of the things we work with. The bigger they are, the more stuff is there functionally.
Great. And I know, like, talking to some of the private lands foresters, like, sometimes even the smallest things can make a big impact too. Like, it's just whatever you're working with, um, just doing whatever's best for that area
I'll
can make
give
it.
you I'll give you kind of a story on that. This is kind of the way I look at most of this stuff. When you're looking at like the level that you're paying attention to on these, essentially I put everything down to one bird or one, nesting area. And you start, some of these smaller grassland restorations that are like on corners of agricultural fields and things like that, you may really literally have one or two nesting individuals in there. I mean, that's the impact is quote small, but it's still an impact. And so when you start building these and you start thinking about it on the order of one organism and you build your units relative to one organism and then you build another one of those to two, I mean, I mark a lot of timber. I mean, I've marked thousands of acres of timber, and much of it has been with a habitat goal. And my focus at the time I'm marking that tree is that tree, but it's in a little bit smaller context in the area. I'm going to mark maybe 10 acres a day, 8 acres if it's really good, and 15 or 20 if it's a little crappier timber, so I can go faster. And you may only really literally be working on habitat elements for one or two or maybe three birds during that time period, but you're building that as you go across the property. And one last thing on that, there's a lot of these elements that are literally important for only 1 or 2 days out of the year, but they are extremely important for those 1 or 2 days out of the year. And so, or even sometimes they're not important every year, they're only important every 2 or 3 years. So, I mean, these are not neotropical migratory, but they're like grouse,
Mhm.
where we get, these winters with grouse. where we get a rain on snow event. And it doesn't happen every winter, or where we get a really warm period where we get these ice lenses in the snow. These grouse can't snow roost after that. And in areas that we have things, as an example, like dewberry, dewberry insulates the snow from the ground, and it actually allows a place for the water to fall through so they can still snow roost in it. Those little patches of dewberry maybe only make an impact every 3 or 4 years, but in those years it makes an impact, it's a huge impact. I look at my house. Every year I have Tennessee warblers come by my house and they nectar on apple blossoms. And I have hundreds of apple trees. I love apples and I've been grafting all kinds of them. My farm has apple trees around every field and every, edge. And they come in and, it's a big beacon to them and they use it for like 2 days. But that's a sugar source in that narrow window of time. That's an important sugar source. On the way back in fall, I have a lot of grapes. They stop and they poke holes and drink the juice out of the grapes. So I get to see Tennessee warblers, but I see them like for 1 or 2 days in spring and maybe a little longer. And this fall, I saw them for quite a bit longer, and I'm not sure why they hung around a little bit more. But you get a window that's a relatively narrow window, but extremely important during that window.
Mhm.
But yeah.
I was surprised by the gray catbirds. Did either of you have any surprises while you were analyzing the data?
What part of the gray catbirds was surprising?
I don't know. I guess I was just surprised there was like so much more on the GWW site.
Oh, yeah. So, I guess for catbirds, like a lot of people think of those as like an everywhere bird, especially
Hmm.
because they're really common in like parks and like you can find them in a bunch of different habitats and stuff. The gray catbirds, like the Greenwood West site, potentially has more edge habitat available since it's by that field, so that may be a component of that.
Hmm.
So to try and like tease out the impact of things. There's also past data that we're looking at for those sites. So to be able to like single out the fire component as opposed to that edge component. So for some of those species, the fact that they utilize more edge habitat may be in part because of the location of
Hmm.
that site in relation to the field nearby it.
What I will say on some of these species, though, I'll use the brown thrasher as an example. They're an interesting bird because we do quite a bit of prescribed burning, and so I'm on an awful lot of burns in a year, and we're on a particularly good number of them in spring. That bird, while the ground still has fire on the coarse fuel, will be sitting in the trees above screaming. And we've actually talked about this. We will get data on this in the future on how quickly these birds come in after prescribed burns,
Mm-hmm.
because we've had prescribed burns where, like, I have turkeys walking in through ground that's still smoking. You can see that they're happily looking for cooked insects.
Yeah, that's also a component for catbirds is like they do eat a lot of fruit, but if available, insects provide more like bang for their buck in terms of like energy. So they would do a similar thing to turkeys where they're probably looking around for insects that are trying to like crawl out of the ground or bugs that are already deceased.
And we've seen that there's an element of how it changes the habitat. There's also an element of change in immediate available food resources too. And it is interesting how quickly some of these species, like Amelia and I have talked about this, where we're going to do some prescribed burns this spring, or well, right now essentially, but next spring also. And with the hope of actually watching who comes in immediately afterwards, because it's been interesting, like anecdotally, because I'm always paying more attention to other stuff at the time. I'm listening to the birds, but I got to avoid people having bad stuff happen with the prescribed burns. So I've anecdotally observed a lot of kind of cool stuff, but I want to have actual data on what's happening afterwards. And the turkey thing, those things they're still in there with the coarse fuels burning. They are extremely fast about moving back in. Same thing with the brown thrashers.
That's fascinating. That reminded me of another question I had is why, Amelia, did you pick 25 days after the fire to do the? to do the surveys? Was that just a
Sure.
random day?
So the 25 days, so the burn got done, I think, pretty close to the last like opening window that we could burn. And that was just because there were a lot of like moving parts on getting that going.
Hmm.
So the 25 days post fire was not planned to be post fire at that time. The reason that I picked that date is to line up with the past data. So for past data, the survey started sometime between the 27th of May and the 31st of May. So I chose that date to try and be more consistent for comparability for past years before it was burned.
So we have data from for those sites from 2021, 2022, and 2023 prior to them being burned for the prescribed burn sites.
Hmm.
And then we have post burn data. And so the idea being that if I have a consistent enough, repeated enough data set before, all of the weird stuff associated with just initial, because each site's different. As much as we want a comparison unit, each site's got weirdness to it. And so if we have background data for what this was like before we burned it, and then what happens afterwards, and then what the response is through time afterwards, it's a little bit cleaner data set. So yeah, for all of those sites, we have 3 years of pre-data before any burns.
Hmm.
Two of them are scheduled for this fall with the recognition that this summer it didn't do anything but rain. And now this fall, it's been protracted and weird.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping they'll burn this fall and like very hopeful, but I'm also realistic that this is a challenge to hit burn windows every year.
Hmm.
And something else to note about the importance of like surveying within as close of like the same start date as possible is that some of these bird species come through in one short burst in certain areas early in the season. So they migrate through at different times. So for
Yeah.
example, the white-throated sparrow observation, those are like an early season bird. So that was also part of trying to make sure that things lined up in terms of consistency.
Hmm. Awesome. Anyone have any other questions?
I'll leave you with one thought. I'm really going to encourage if there are people on here who are actually wanting to try to use this tool. We will have this available in, I'll say, the not too distant future with the recognition that we're human beings. So definitely by, after sometime in January or so, it'll probably, when it realistically will be available.
Mhm.
Um, and it would be really neat to have people go through that because I know for me, frankly, even if I'm the only user of this tool, it's going to be useful because I have built those tables for talking to people so many times manually
Hmm.
that having something where they can just be typed in, hit a button, and they but spit the results out is going to be, even for just me, if I'm the only user, it's going to be useful.
Hmm.
But I think it'll be something for people that are really know a lot about birds would still be useful for people who are interested in birds with um, less knowledge. It will be an amazing tool.
And like getting an initial feedback period from users on that would be really valuable. So certainly if anyone is interested in testing out the tool, your feedback would be highly valued. So please contact me for that.
And otherwise, it's just going to be developed for my use case, and that's not the
Yeah, because something very important to me with the tool is that I want to make sure that it's useful for the target audience. So that's a big
Hmm.
part of what the testing is for.
Have you
Sorry,
ever,
this is, oh, sorry.
go Peg?
Yeah, this is Peg. Sorry, I lost internet connection, but did you mention what the geographic range is for that tool? Like what area does it cover and what habitat types? Sorry if I missed that.
Oh, no worries. So for the tool, it is as much as possible specific to Wisconsin information. The range for a lot of those species, like general overviews, is nationwide. So in the United States for their breeding habitat, with the exception of like Western states. So like the East Coast and the Midwest are covered in that. But then when you get into specific species that they use, so those lists that I had for some of those birds or trees that they use, as much as possible, I narrowed that to just Wisconsin information. And if I could find information for Wisconsin, then I used Minnesota. So as much as possible, it's going to be specific to the Midwest region.
And
Okay, and is it
Paul,
more than just oak forest? Is it more than?
no,
Okay.
where we
Yes,
have,
it's sorry. I was gonna say, yeah, it's more than oak forest. It's every neotropical migratory songbird that comes through here.
so
All right,
our data with prescribed fire is restricted to the oak forest. However, our data for the overall project, so there's two separate projects. The oak one is one subset of it. We have northern hardwood forest represented. We have aspen and conifer forest, and we have a mix of types of conifer. We have anywhere from really strong representation of hemlock to sites that have more spruce fir cover. So these, when we originally set up these sites over the last 17 years, we've been trying to target, so we hit most of the most common voluminous species groups in northern and central Wisconsin. I think we have
great.
almost everything in the anywhere from about central Wisconsin north. We have most of the main timber types represented. South of that, we don't. And I'll always say that's just because we're human beings. We essentially, there's only so much. This is 17 years of work, and I'm going to do it till I retire. But there's just only, you know what I'm saying? There's only so much we can actually do.
Yep. Great. Thank you.
Great question. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you so much, Amelia and Mike, for being here today and providing such a great presentation on your project. I'm excited to see where this tool goes, and hopefully it'll help with our Forestry for Wisconsin Birds effort. So
Thanks for
thank
having
you.
Thank
us.
you.
Yeah, thanks. Have a great day, everybody.